Did you know the Nigerians govern a sector of space occupied by several different humanoid species?
If we say yes, will you feed us?
One of those species is the Benkarans. They occupy just 10% of Nigerian space, but take up nearly 80% of the space in Nigerian prisons.
Maybe they commit more crimes.
So we're seeing a large amount of black mob violence. If that sounds rough, well, look at the videos. Are these not in fact mobs? Well, they look like mobs to me. If this is not a mob, I don't know what you would call a mob. Okay, are they black? Well, they look mostly black to me. I know there's kind of a psyop going on, say, oh, it's white people who did this somehow. I don't know how on earth they're trying to pull that off. Okay, are they violent? Well, they look violent to me. Okay, violent black mobs, true. There's nothing incorrect in pointing that out. What triggered these riots? Well, a news event. Okay, what is news? What is news? Is it anything that I say? Is it anything that your friend says? Is it, some people may say in the colloquial sense, oh, that's news to me. But when we say news with a capital N, we're really talking about something that is said by specific organizations that are promoted by the government, promoted by universities, promoted by NGOs, and treated as authoritative by these institutions. And that's part of promotion, is treating as authoritarian. And you know who I'm talking about. CNN, NBC, Fox, ABC, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, the usual suspects. So we know what capital N news is. They're sort of like text and video blog platforms, and they give jobs to people with journalism majors from certain universities that control the supply of the journalism majors that go into these places. These journalism majors who write these stories, and they give their ice cold takes in front of cameras, they're easy to control because they, with a very few exceptions, can't get an audience on their own. And that's perfect. That makes them easy to control because they're sort of locked into their career as a journalism major working for CNN, for example. And these groups, these sort of text and video blog groups like CNN, they have been elevated by other institutions. And I don't know if there's some grand conspiracy about this, but the effect is that they control what the public is thinking about. That's the effect. Whether it's planned, whether it just sort of happened, whether it's emergent, doesn't matter. The effect is that they operate to control what the public is thinking about and what facts they know. In early YouTube, I've been around long enough to know about the pre-Google YouTube. The CNN channel, the New York Times channel, they couldn't draw flies to poop. Nobody cared about what they had to say about anything. Only later, when YouTube and Google became publishers and started to elevate these, what I'm going to call the highly controlled blog and video groups like CNN, then they got people to see it and start taking them seriously again. Otherwise, if not for Google and the real power structure promoting these blog and video groups, you'd just watch independent journalists dumping raw feeds, and there'd be nobody to tell you how to feel about anything or select which facts you're supposed to know. It'd just be sort of a random mishmash of stuff that people happen to record as they're walking around, sort of citizen journalists. Now, this is the context in which people like Mike Cernovich or Mitt Romney are speaking. They're speaking on the topics which this sort of controlled media tells them that they should care about. Now, in 2019, there were 370 whites who were shot to death by police, 235 blacks, 158 Hispanics, 39 other, and 202 of unknown race who were shot and killed by police. This averages to about 2.75 per day, so, if all these are treated equally, you should be hearing about 2 to 3 police shootings per day, and a few other deaths by other methods. Most of it's done by shootings. That's how police actually kill people. But, in this case of George Floyd, that's actually not a shooting. But most of the time it's a shooting. But you're not hearing about them. You hear about selected instances which are selected for you to tell you what to care about and how to feel about it. This is also sort of why it's basically impossible that this is some sort of revolutionary action against the system, right? When the system, quote unquote, is telling you precisely to care about this. And they're telling the police to stand down and let you destroy, people's lives in destroying their businesses and destroying their livelihoods and stuff. Target will be fine. They have insurance. They're a big corporation. They'll be, and even if that fails, they'll be bailed out by Congress. So, going after Target or going after Walmart or anything is not going to have any effect because they're part of this. They're part of the system and they'll be protected. The people you're destroying are the small businesses, right? Would you have heard about Floyd George or George Floyd if it wasn't on the news, quote unquote, on the news? Of course not. An event you otherwise never would have heard about becomes elevated and then made important. And CNN, NBC, New York Times, Fox, they're all the same. They all report the same stories because they're not actually independent meaningfully. They serve the same function. That's why you can say something like, I heard it on the news, because they're all the same. It's the same news. They're controlled the same way and they serve the same function. And it doesn't matter who's writing the stories. In fact, you probably have no idea who writes any particular story. You just see that CNN tag and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter because they're all just compliant journalism majors. They're interchangeable, and they were pre-filtered by the process of getting a journalism degree. They're actually a kind of bureaucrat. And that's why these news outlets have a bureaucratic feel to them, because that's precisely what they are. Now, regarding police shootings, which is most of police killings, the case of Floyd George, he wasn't shot, but whatever. We're talking about police killings, and the main way police kill people is by shooting. So the data on police shootings is going to reflect overall police killings. Blacks are, of course, overrepresented compared to their number. Okay, but they're not overrepresented based on homicide rate or as a percentage of people who shot the police. Blacks, 12.6% of the U.S. population in 2019, but 29.3% of the people killed by cops where the race is known were black. However, blacks made up 34.09% of cop killers where the race is known. Whites and Hispanics combined make up 65.83% of the people killed by cops in shootings and made up 63.64% of cop killers. In terms of the cop killers, the FBI doesn't distinguish whites from Hispanics, so the cop killer number is a combination of whites and Hispanics. If you separated whites from Hispanics, I suspect the white proportion in isolation would be lower. So it seems to line up, at least in the big picture. Blacks appear to simply be more aggressive towards cops if the rate of cop killing is a good indicator of overall aggression. Not saying that this is justified or anything, but it's a case against racial bias. Cops can still be assholes generally. They could be. But the point here is a racial bias. And whenever you do a proper analysis of data on this, racial bias doesn't come out once you consider behavior of groups, of demographic groups. So when a story piece is pushed by the controlled media, they only push one type of event, and that is when a white cop kills a black victim, or in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, it's white people killing a black man. Now, assuming all cops are white, which they're not, but if we assumed all cops are white, that would only happen 29% of the time in terms of who's killing who. Now, in 2018, don't have data from 2019, in 2018, whites and Hispanics were 77.1% of all police officers. If officers have an even racial distribution, this means that in all likelihood, only 22.38% of police killings involve white or Hispanic officers and a black victim. But in reality, black neighborhoods tend to have blacker police forces. Not as black as the neighborhoods they're policing. Police, as a rule, are whiter than the general population, but blacks are probably more likely to deal with a black cop than white people are. And since black cops are actually more likely than white cops to shoot a black person in a given encounter, this would all mean that the percentage of police killings that involve a white cop and a black victim is going to be less than 22.38% of the time. Also, take out the Hispanic number, whatever that is, it's going to be less as a result of that as well. So I don't know what the exact number is. It's probably going to be somewhere around 17% of all police killings involve a non-Hispanic white cop and a black victim. Although that's just an estimate based on percentages of the population. But we know for a fact that it's no more than 29%. Absolutely. And it's probably no more than 22.38%, almost certainly no more than 22.38%. And given the Hispanic proportion of the quote-unquote white cops, it's going to be less than that. And also given the fact that black people are more likely to interact with a black cop than a white person, that's going to drive that down even as non-Hispanic whites as a percentage of the cops who shoot blacks. And yet, that scenario where a non-Hispanic white cop kills a black person, that is all you ever see. That is the only scenario that is presented to you by the journalism major clubs. The question you should be asking is, why do these interchangeable journalism majors who work at controlled media orgs only highlight killings with a white cop and a black victim, when it happens that combination probably only around 17% of the time? Those who think that by protesting this, that you are fighting the system, honey, this is a system narrative that was presented to you. They want you mad about this. The only reason you are mad about this is because this was picked and highlighted and presented to you. That's why they're showing you this. Because Joe Biden is a trash candidate and they need to gin you up to vote for him, okay? You're being ginned up to believe in unreality because they need you to vote for a guy who has dementia, Joe. And that's why Donald Trump is sending the DOJ after those white guys who shot Ahmaud Arbery. Because Trump wants you to think he's on your side. He's not, and neither is Biden. But all this is just a game to get you ginned up to vote for Biden, and Trump is trying to counter that by posturing that he's on your side. Consider the free cash Trump mailed out that blacks got at disproportionate rates. The establishment doesn't want Trump, even though Trump isn't really doing anything meaningful to destroy the establishment, but they still don't like him. They want dementia head Biden because he's controllable, right? Just like the journalism majors at the alphabet soup controlled media orgs. They like having those journalism majors who can't make it on their own because then they're bound to the quote-unquote news agency like CNN, and they can then be controlled and they then toe the line. They don't get too creative. They don't strike out on their own. They're in sort of the New York Times, Fox, NBC, CNN sort of plantation, that whole sort of system. And so they're presenting you with white cop, black victim stories in order to get you hopped up and angry, even though these are extremely rare events and don't even reflect racial bias once black behavior is taken into account. If you compare the percent of blacks killed by cops versus the blacks who commit homicides, blacks commit consistently about half of all homicides where the race of the perpetrator is known, and this is far less than the percentage that blacks make up among those killed by the cops. And I use homicide as an indicator of general criminality because with things like robbery and assault and rape, these are all subject to reporting variance and police leniency. And with homicide, there's no judgment call. There's a dead body, the crime happened. The only issue with homicide is who done it, but that's also a problem with any other crime. Homicide is at least free of the problem of determining if a crime occurred. So the closest lifeline to reality in terms of race differences in general criminality is going to be the homicide number.